just for your listening pleasure, there's nothing going on in D.C. right now. You can't hear anything because, well, they're doing nothing. Count how much money we are spending right here. Just pictured over $1 million of taxpayer funds being wasted. Thank you, you worthless congressmen and senators. Well, you're still technically a member of Congress. Whatever. You get it. Or don't you? Do-do-do. Quit whispering, Steve. You're scaring me. No. Please like, share, and subscribe. I got to do something on that monitor real quick because I forgot. I was ill prepared. And yeah, I need to drag this over here so I can send shipping confirmation. Shipping confirmation. All right, goodbye. No, wrong one. Oh my goodness. Real quick, you know what we do here at when we have boxes that aren't big enough, right? We combine two boxes. If it comes broken, that's on you. Anyway, I'm going to go to CVS and drop this off. I'm just going to leave this on until something happens. Because remember, they work for you. Yes, right now is the only time you'll hear any truths being said in Congress because, well, they're not talking. Do you see what I did there? All right, seriously, I'll be back in like 10 minutes. Red Bull time.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Last night, our Democratic colleagues released a draft short-term government funding bill. Big parts of the draft are unobjectionable because they were negotiated across party lines. Both sides of the aisle want to prevent a government shutdown that no one wants. Both sides want to keep resources flowing to disaster-stricken communities. In fact, both the Democratic chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Leahy, and the Republican vice chairman, Senator Shelby, have stated publicly that this poison, excuse me, Mr. President, I've got a misplaced page here. As I was saying, both sides want to continue time-sensitive support for Ukraine, but unfortunately, our Democratic colleagues decided to put in extraneous partisan language, in fact, a poison pill. This extraneous poison pill is not related to keeping the government open. It was not negotiated across the aisle. In fact, both the Democratic chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Leahy, and the Republican Vice Chairman, Senator Shelby, as I was saying earlier, have stated publicly that this poison pill should not be in the underlying bill. The poison pill is a phony attempt to address an important topic of permitting reform. It is much too difficult to build things in America and unleash American energy. Liberal regulations and red tape are a huge part of the problem. That's why Republicans are the leaders on this issue. That's why my colleague, Senator Capito, has introduced a strong, robust package that would actually move the ball forward. What our Democratic colleagues have produced is a phony fig leaf that would actually set back the cause of real permitting reform. This is an issue where it should be very easy to improve upon the status quo. But amazingly, our Democratic colleagues have managed to write language that would actually, listen to this, make things even worse. Senator Manchin's bill goes out of its way to avoid actually amending the National Environmental Policy Act or any other environmental law. It layers new bureaucracy on top of existing bureaucracy. Its new requirements and deadlines are paper tigers with no enforcement. The few parts of this legislation that would actually change the status quo would take things from bad to worse. For example, yesterday, a long list of state attorneys general wrote the Senate a panicked letter explaining that Senator Manchin's language would, quote, eviscerate states' ability to chart their own land use and energy policies. Eviscerate states' ability to chart their own land use and energy policies. Among other problems, they explain how this legislation creates a backdoor to sneak through an electricity grid takeover, much like the Obama administration's unconstitutional so-called Clean Power Plan. These state-level officials are also sounding the alarm about higher costs for their citizens. They write the Manchin proposal could impose, quote, potentially backbreaking costs on residents who may see no true benefit, no true energy benefit whatsoever. Democrats' policies already have electricity costs skyrocketing at the fastest rate in more than 40 years. The last thing that struggling families need are more Democratic policies that raise utility bills even higher still. This phony fig leaf is permitting reform in name only. It was written to drain the political will for actual reform without creating any meaningful change that liberal special interests might actually dislike. If tepid Democratic support for this phony fig leaf is all that our colleague from West Virginia got in return for approving yet another taxing and spending spree during an inflation crisis, it's hard to imagine a worse bargain for a senator or for the country. So, Mr. President, if the Senate votes today on proceeding to a bill that has this partisan poison pill jammed into it, I'll be voting no, and I would urge all my colleagues to vote no as well. This all-Democratic government has a smooth and obvious path on government funding. The path is obvious. Drop the extraneous partisan language and let the bipartisan CR move forward. Now, on an entirely different matter, this afternoon, those of us on the Rules Committee will mark up a bipartisan package of updates to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Strongly support the modest changes that our colleagues in the working group have fleshed out after literally months of detailed discussions. I'll proudly support the legislation, provided that nothing more than technical changes are made to its current form. I particularly want to thank Senator Collins and Senators Capito, Murkowski, Portman, Romsey, Sass, Tillis, and Young for their intense work with Democratic colleagues to get this right. Congress' process for counting the presidential electors' votes was written 135 years ago. The chaos that came to a head on January 6th of last year certainly underscored the need for an update. So did Januaries of 2001, 2005, and 2017, in each of which Democrats tried to challenge the lawful election of a Republican president. Obviously, in every case, our system of government won out. The Electoral Count Act ultimately produced the right conclusion. Certainly, finality, and the transfer of power to the winning candidate, but it's clear the country needs a more predictable path to that outcome. This bipartisan bill does not rashly replace current law with something untested. It keeps what's worked well and modestly updates what has not. The bill's sponsors debated every provision and found bipartisan consensus. Bad ideas were left on the cutting room floor. The resulting product, this bill, as introduced, is the only chance to get an outcome and to actually make law. Here's what the legislation does. It raises the threshold for objecting to the electoral count, preserving options if something incredibly unlikely were to happen, but ensuring claims with hardly any support can't paralyze the process. It makes the already plain fact of the 12th Amendment even clearer, that the Vice President has never had and will never have discretionary powers over the counting. It protects states' primacy in appointing their electors, but ensures they publicize the rules actually before the election. It rejects unwise challenges like creating new causes of action that would leave every election up to the courts and create uncertainty. It makes modest technical updates to other pertinent laws, such as the Presidential Transitions Act. And Senator Collins' bill does all those modest but important things without capitulating to our Democratic colleagues' obsession with a sweeping federal takeover of all of our election law. So I look forward to supporting the legislation as introduced in committee. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Still nothing? I went all the way to the post office and back and still nothing? My goodness. Not the post office. I went to UPS. No, CNN. No, where'd I go? CVS. There we go. Now you know it.
President?
Senator from Illinois.
Quorum
Quorum
call.
call?
Senate is in a quorum call.
They're not voting on
Consent to
anything.
Quorum call be suspended,
Quorum.
please.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to do something unusual on the floor of the Senate. I'd like to report some good news. It isn't often we have those reports. Today I have 3 items in my news that I'd like to share with people who are following this. Start my remarks by sharing an incredible story from the other side of the world. In May 2020,
Sure, it's
as the
used
world was
properly, and that
reeling from the
exhausts
spread of a deadly new strain of coronavirus, the Red Cross Society in the African nation of Kenya received 500 bicycles from a Chicago-based non-governmental organization known as World Bicycle Relief.
Right, ramp it up.
Community health workers use these bicycles to make house visits across southern Kenya, providing health services to remote communities who would otherwise not be reached because of restrictions on movement due to COVID-19. In Malawi, young girls use these bicycles to get...
Boring. Hey, you guys want to hear something exciting? For the duration of the hurricane, we're going to actually be running our own. Now, I know you guys are super excited about this. We're going to be running our own. Fuck me, bro. Can I get this? Can I move it over right there? Our own Hurricane Watch live stream. Yeah. Isn't that exciting? Are you super excited about it? Yeah. And you can see this. This is going to be on Citizen Stringer TV YouTube page. We're just going to leave it live. It's going to stay live the whole time. But it's going to be very good. Watch. Let me show you because you have no idea what I'm saying. Check this out. Yes. So we're going to be running it. And the person behind it, although I don't think he has a mic hooked up, is Adam, right? So he is running that live stream out, and we will cover everything that's happening with the hurricane as it goes. But yeah, I can't give a play-by-play unless I tap into this one and then do it. And I could do that, like, you know. So tonight we'll check in, you know, when I do my show. But like Reed Timmer is the one that's down on the bottom there.
I got my sweat.
And he's got a sweatband. Very nice. And we've got Tampa feeds, Deerfield Beach feeds. Can't see where that one is. That just says Florida, but I believe that's Tampa as well. Starting to rain there. Fort Myers getting a little hairy out there. Florida Keys, I don't know. It's not looking that bad for some reason. Not quite sure why. Someone's calling me. Let's see. Buenos noches. Yes. That is literally the worst accent I've ever heard any person try to make. Like that's like you're not even trying, bud. Unfortunately, see, you know what I wish I did? You know what I wish I turned on Bluetooth so you went through my soundboard so all of my viewers got to hear just how bad that was. No, get a real job, buddy. All right. He tries to talk like he's from Alabama or something. Or not Alabama. I don't even know what. Louisiana? That was the worst. I don't know if you guys could hear that. But man, that was bad. Anyway, so yeah, we're running this live stream on Citizen Stringer TV's page, which is where you're watching this if you're watching on YouTube anyway. So we're running 2 consecutive live feeds now because we're high tech like that. Adam is also running this out on his social media pages. He's the one that's kind of, you know, pressing the buttons in the back end. You know what I'm saying? But I won't be chiming in on this that much. But let's go back to the Senate because that's why we're here today, right? To show what's going on with the Senate. Are they going to vote to send an additional $12 billion to Ukraine? Yes. Yes, they are. But they're talking about something. So let's tune in. Who's this? Who's this guy? I don't even care. Waste of taxpayer funds.
Manage his diabetes, Trulicity.
Diabetes.
Do you know what a 1-month prescription costs for Trulicity? $2,000. So what does Philip do who can't work and has a fixed income? He tries to cut the pills in half to make his prescription last longer. Sometimes he just skips the medication altogether. He is not alone. 1 in 5 Americans do not take their medications as prescribed because they're too expensive. In Philip's case, even that isn't enough. At the end of the day, he had to refinance his home. What a time to do it, huh, with the interest rates? Because here in America for too long, we found it acceptable to allow pharmaceutical companies to charge what they wish. Not anymore. We pressed for decades. Both Democrats and Republicans gave these speeches. This was not just a Democratic issue. To lower prescription drugs, at least for seniors. Last month we did it, right here on the floor of the Senate. The Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed without a single Republican vote, is delivering real relief now for families struggling with high prices. A few minutes ago, the Republican leader was on the floor telling us what a terrible bill that was, the Inflation Reduction Act. He didn't mention the fact that it's going to do some remarkable things. It makes historic investments to address the climate crisis. That's one thing. It includes investments in renewable, affordable energy sources. That's certainly needed. These investments in renewable energy could save families hundreds of dollars a year in energy cost. That's real relief. Just as an aside, last month, my wife and I decided to put solar panels on our home in Springfield, Illinois. We're not the first in our town, but we're certainly the first in our neighborhood. They predict it'll reduce our electric bill by 85% a month. Think about your own electric bill and what that would mean, money in hand. And their tax credits to put on solar panels. How did we achieve that and put tax credits in for heat pumps and electric water heaters? In the Inflation Reduction Act, which Senator McConnell just came to the floor and said was a terrible bill. I think you're going to see more and more Americans making the choice our family made. I think they should. The Inflation Reduction Act also is going to lower health care costs, one of the biggest items in every family's budget. First, begin to let Medicare negotiate fair prices for medications used by seniors. Is that a radical idea, that a federal agency, on behalf of the people it serves, negotiates for lower drug prices? It's an idea that's been at work in the Veterans Administration for years. The VA, our VA, serving our veterans, men and women who serve this country, pays on average half of what Medicare pays for exactly the same drugs now, because VA could negotiate and Medicare could not. The bill which Senator McConnell took exception to now gives Medicare the power to negotiate lower prices for seniors. 83% of Americans think that's a pretty good idea. How do we get 83% of Americans to agree on anything? They agree on that, that's a good idea. 71% of the people from the party of the senator from Kentucky. Second, the Inflation Reduction Act will cap the price Medicare recipients pay for insulin, $35 a month for Medicare recipients. That's the limit. And it limits seniors' out-of-pocket expenses for all medications to $2,000 a year. Remember Phil? Phil was paying $2,000 a month for Trulicity. Under this bill, which we passed here a month ago, without a single vote from the other side of the aisle, we're going to limit seniors' responsibility under Medicare for prescription drugs to $2,000 a year. By the way, I believe we should cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for everybody, not just seniors. Guess what radical nation, what socialist nation does that? Canada. Canada does it, and pharmaceutical companies still make a healthy profit. They just don't make a killing on a life-saving drug. Third, the Inflation Reduction Act will curb the outrageous cost increases that Medicare beneficiaries pay for medications. It does that by tying prescription drug price increases to the cost of living. Pharmaceutical companies that raise their prices faster are going to pay a penalty if they do. The days of Big Pharma raising prices they charge seniors at 5 or 10 times the rate of inflation are over. Of course, the pharmaceutical giants and their lobbyists fought us every step of the way. They said, you put limits on the prices we can charge, and we're going to have to cut our research. Guess what they didn't tell you, and what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not admit? It isn't true. Studies have found that Big Pharma could lose $1 trillion in sales over the next decade, and it would still remain the most profitable industry in America. By the way, did you know these pharmaceutical companies spend more money on advertising and marketing than they do on research? Point two, Did you know that the research that they're using is based on research started at the National Institute of Health at the expense of American taxpayers? And I'm all for the National Institutes of Health. They use what the NIH develops to make new drugs. It's a good thing to do, and they're very profitable as they do it. So I don't want to hear that they can charge less and they're not going to be able to survive. I don't believe it. And it's not only seniors who will save on health care costs. More than 14 million Americans who receive their health coverage through the Affordable Care Act marketplace will save hundreds, even thousands of dollars on their monthly insurance premiums because of the Inflation Reduction Act. Under the American Rescue Plan, we lowered monthly premiums for middle-income families and those with ACA health plans. The Inflation Reduction Act will continue this for another 3 years, and I hope I'm here to renew it. No one should go without medical care ever, but especially not when we're fighting a worldwide pandemic. Not only did our Republican colleagues vote against what I've just described to you, lowering monthly premiums for families nationwide, they went further and tried every way they could think to gut the Affordable Care Act. 2 weeks ago, a federal judge in the Northern District of Texas ruled that the Affordable Care Act's requirement that health plans offer free preventive health services like vaccinations was unconstitutional. In 2020, because of the ACA, 152 million Americans received these preventive health services with no out-of-pocket cost, often resulting in the early detection of cancer, heart disease, and other serious conditions. Now a group of Texas residents and businesses argue that that just violates their basic religious liberty. Religious liberty. And they picked a judge who's been friendly to them in the past. This same judge in northern Texas ruled that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional. That was overturned by the Supreme Court, thank goodness. 12 years after the ACA became law, it's long past time for both parties to support this effort, which provides health insurance for millions of Americans at affordable cost. We need to bring down the cost of health care and prescription drugs for all American families. The last item of good news comes from a blog, which I read rather religiously, and it's a lady in Maine, Heather Cox Richardson. Almost every day she publishes a column for those who want to read it. And I don't know if there's a subscription cost. She asks from time to time if you want to contribute to her effort. I do. Well, today's is one that I think is worth reading and remembering. And she says, a headline in the New York Times read, "Factory jobs are booming like it's the 1970s." The story explained that more money in the hands of consumers thanks to federal stimulus spending, along with the new skepticism of stretched supply lines, has created a rebound in American manufacturing. Since 1970, outsourcing and automation have meant that every recession has seen factory jobs disappear in America and never return. Well, there's good news. We now know that we have not only regained all the manufacturing jobs lost during the pandemic, we've added 67,000 more. Those numbers would be higher if the labor market weren't so tight, a condition leading employers to offer higher wages and better benefits. And the other point that she makes that's worth noting is that the National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese, told reporters one of the most striking things we're seeing is that American companies are committing to build and expand right here at home because of supply chain concerns. Meanwhile, get this, the real net worth of the bottom 50% of U.S. households has climbed 60% in the last year and a half, now reaching $67,524. Inflation is a problem. Don't get me wrong. It's a challenge. Gasoline prices seem to be creeping down, at least in the Midwest. I can't speak for all over the country. Food prices are still too high. I've been to the supermarket over the weekend. I know what's going on. But we are seeing some evidence of progress on the economic front, and I certainly hope that's continued. Mr. President, I ask consent that this column by Heather Cox Richardson be included in my remarks.
Without objection.
Without objection, I ask consent to yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Oh, see, I had to unmute myself. Mute myself because I was like being like, this guy's lying. All right. So this is the hurricane footage that I will show you in just 1 second. We are running this on Citizen Stringer TV YouTube page. You don't even need to go anywhere. You can just, can you do picture in picture? Oh, I can. Maybe I'll just do the whole show tonight talking about this. So you can see down in the bottom right-hand side, that is Reed Timmer. He's a meteorologist that chases around, super well known. I think he's been on TV shows and all that stuff. And then we have live cameras from as far south as Key West. Actually, I don't know. Yeah, well, we do. We have the Key West one right there, upper right-hand side. Then we got Fort Myers, Florida. Then we've got Florida somewhere, Deerfield Beach and Tampa. So pretty sweet, right? Pretty sweet. So we're going to have to see what happens, what goes on. But yeah, Jeff, if you're watching, you got to reply to that email I just sent you, buddy, because I got to fight that charge back. So you got to reply. Yeah, it's insane stuff. I have my son's football game in a little bit. And yeah, I wasn't going to talk at all during this. I was going to still try to work. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to switch this back over here because if you guys want to watch that, you can go over to our other YouTube page. And, oh, look at that. Man, he got high tech all in this. We're running, look at that. That's what I'm talking about. You guys have no idea, but it's cool. So they're doing stuff on the Senate floor. So let's go back over there and I'll shut up.
Madam President,
Senator from Connecticut.
sorry to surprise you, Madam President. Ask that we dispense with the quorum call, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. I rise just for two requests. I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
I now note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
You guys having fun yet? This is some boring shit. I thought they were going to actually start doing something. They're doing a quorum call, which I think everybody has to check in that they're listening. But isn't this crazy? It's 3 o'clock. It's 4:15 in the afternoon, in the evening, early evening now. And these lazy ass politicians are not even there. It's very, very odd to me. Very odd. Anyway, on our other YouTube channel, well, on the same channel, just a different live stream, we are running our Hurricane Ian watch. We have camera feeds from Deerfield Beach, University of Tampa, Florida Keys, Fort Myers, and then another one of a bridge in Florida somewhere. We're going to be running that until the hurricane is over. That'll stay live the entire time. And we'll go that way. It'll be nice and fun. Adam is the one behind there. Yeah, he's the one pressing the buttons. Many of you guys that have been watching for a long time, you know who Adam is. And for all those that don't, well, you don't. But he's a good dude. And I called him and I was like, hey, how hard would it to be? And he logged into my computer and we tried to do it and it wasn't working. And he's like, I got a computer. I'll just do it right now. I'm like, yeah, do it. Because I thought it would be cool just to have it running the whole time. And then at night on Citizen Stringer TV on Facebook, plus that YouTube page will stay live the whole time. But then also on Facebook, we will, or not Facebook, I'm sorry, Citizen Stringer TV. Instead of showing riot coverage overnight, we're going to be showing this. And that way everyone, because I think it's supposed to make landfall tomorrow morning around 3 a.m. or tomorrow night. I don't remember. But we should see it. Reed Timmer is currently on the ground out there. He's a meteorologist / storm chaser. I believe he's been with everybody, Weather Channel, AccuWeather, all that stuff. But he's currently chasing down the tornado. Or not tornado. There's tornado warnings all over the place too. The hurricane, trying to wait for it to see what is going to transpire. They are still on this quorum call that's lasting forever. It's very annoying. Mr. Meatball said, I can't find a link to the coffee business. It's not working right now because I'm doing stuff on the back end. And if you are connected to the Twitch streamer, April has the information for you. I gave it to her yesterday. She'll reply back as soon as she has time. But I gave her the information, the minimum orders and all that stuff to do what you guys were inquiring about. But yeah. But yeah, I'm doing stuff on the back end of the website, so I actually took it down for the week. Also, here's something special that you guys may or may not have known up here. If you donate via Cash App, via Venmo, via PayPal, put what platform you watch the stream on. I'm just going to pick one person at random tonight, and they're going to get a Canon EOS T8i. Several lenses come with it, nice carrying bag, a bunch of batteries. I bought this to do live streaming with here in the studio, except I didn't read the instructions or I didn't finish watching the video because this was not the camera they were mentioning. The camera they were mentioning was about twice as much as this. But this is a really great camera. It just auto shuts off after 30 minutes. So when you do live streams, that typically last an hour and a half at minimum, it doesn't work because you got to like press the button 3 times to fix it. So I decided I was going to sell it anyway. I decided let's make it interesting and give it to one of the viewers. So if you want a chance of doing that, and it's not a giveaway, but I'm just going to pick one person randomly that follows the instructions I gave before. Anyway, looks like Adam is messing around with the thing, trying to get it to work. So that's good. And he'll figure it out or it'll just crash, one or the other. And yeah, this hearing's live. As I said, I'm just going to keep the Senate hearing up. I got to get ready because my son has a football game today. So we're going to go watch that, or I'm going to go watch that. Hopefully it doesn't rain. And then I will be live tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern time. I'm really excited about this football game because they have hot dogs. And I tell you what, out of any stadium hot dog I've ever had, the hot dogs at this little middle school football game are the best darn hot dogs I ever had. I'm going to ask them where they got them because I want them in my home. I believe it's Costco. I've never had Costco hot dogs before, but I tell you what, I ate 4 of those suckers and a cheeseburger and 2 slices of pizza because I was hungry as shit and I knew I wasn't going to be able to eat for several hours after. Master Meatball said, looking forward to getting a sample pack of the coffee. Yeah, we don't do sample packs. In fact, we don't even do what you guys were asking for. I'm doing it because April wanted me to. But we typically don't do any of that because we just don't have any time. But we want to help you succeed. However, we don't do sample packs. You can order a bag of coffee next week, sample it, decide if you like it, and then go from there. But we don't do sample packs of our coffee unless you order a box, and then you get sample packs in those boxes, if that makes sense. And it's not because we're cheap. It's because the coffee's the best, and we don't need to prove it to you because once you have it, you're addicted, and you can't even stop drinking it. It's addicting. It truly is. It's amazing. And yes, that's me, quite full of my coffee self. They're still not fucking talking in the Senate. How long has this been live? 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, an hour and 21 minutes. I just think about the amount of money. How many senators are there? 100? Let's say $178,000 per year times 100. Let's do some math here. Let's do some math. Someone said, well, I need to know what it tastes like. Master Meatball, buy it then. I assumed you already bought it. See, that deters me a little bit from doing anything because I assumed you already bought it, and that's why you wanted to work with us. Yeah, but whatever. Not the place for these calls. Someone said, what model camera? It's the Canon Rebel T8i. Canon Rebel T8i. All right, so what was I doing? I was going to look. So $178,000 times that son of a gun, and this is a raw salary, times that by 100. All right, so you got 17,800,000. Let's divide that by 365 days, assuming they actually worked every day. Actually, let's not even do that. Let's see how many days. Let's look it up. How many days are senators in Washington, D.C. each year? Let's see. 165 days. 165 days. Is that real? That is insane. 165 days. In 2018, it was 191. And then 2000. So let's go with 190. Let's just say that. 190. So where's my calculator? So let's divide that. So take 17,800,000. Clear. Let's just do 17,800,000. Divide that by 190 days. That's $93,684.21 per day. Let's break that down into hours. Let's say of those 196 hours, they're all working the average of 6 hours, right? So let's divide that by 6. That's $15,614 per hour that they all cost us. So right now, roughly an hour and a half, we've lost about $24,000 in taxpayer funds while they simply do nothing in Washington. Isn't that kind of crazy? Isn't that kind of crazy? I think it is. April, we don't do free coffee. I know you just signed on to Twitch. I saw it. We don't do free coffee. And we certainly don't want to do any co-packing or anything with people that haven't tried the coffee. That doesn't make any sense. You need to try it. Like, for example, before I worked with the roasters, you know what I did? I bought their coffee so I could tell whether I even like it or not. Sure, maybe some roasters give away free samples or make you pay shipping at least. Guess what? They're not the good coffee companies. I'm just being honest with you. That's just my way of thinking and how I do stuff. But you didn't even know I was live. So it is what it is. Scooby-Dooby-Doo. I can't believe they're not doing anything, man. They're not even doing nothing. But whatever. I'm going to put this back up. I'm going to go to the football game at 6 o'clock. This is going to switch for everyone watching on Citizen Stringer TV. our own live streaming at platform, whether you're watching on Roku or Amazon Fire or any of that stuff. You can expect Pizza and Tilly live at 6 p.m. And at 8 p.m., I'll be live to do another episode of The Rational American, although I'm not quite sure what I'll talk about. And then overnight, we will have our hurricane coverage. Very cool. Very exciting, right? At any rate, I will see you guys. Everyone else, if you're watching on social media, this will be live as long as the Senate is live. Once they adjourn for the day, I'll kill the feeds. Or at 6 o'clock, I will cut all these feeds. Or, I'm sorry, 8 o'clock, I'll cut all the feeds and send out the Rational American show to everywhere. All right, but we will see you at 8 p.m.
Senator from Texas.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Madam President, this week the Senate has one extremely important item on our agenda: to keep the lights on. In other words, to pass a government funding bill. We're just 3 days from the end of the fiscal year, and the Democrat-controlled Senate has yet to pass a single appropriations bill. No funding for our military, no funding for veteran services, no funding for border security, nothing. Now, this deadline does not sneak up out of nowhere. It arrives on the same day every year. Yet here we are 3 days before the funding expires, and not a single appropriations bill has been voted on. Now, the majority leader conceded a long time ago that the regular appropriation bills would be punted to a later date, and we would pass a short-term funding bill to bridge the gap. As a general rule, I'm not a fan of short-term funding bills. They don't provide the stability or predictability we need to plan for the future. That's especially true for America's military, which is operating in a dynamic threat environment with countless unknowns. In order to plan for and prepare for the future, government agencies need a predictable budget, and stopgap bills simply don't cut it. As though this last-minute funding gambit isn't dramatic enough, the majority leader has raised the stakes even higher. He's not putting a clean funding bill on the floor, he's weighing it down with partisan freight. This is part of a political horse trade that happened a couple of months ago. In order to get the senior senator from West Virginia to vote for his reckless tax and spending bill, the majority leader promised to attach permitting reform to the government funding bill. Forget the fact that Senator Manchin's permitting bill was nowhere near complete. The majority leader blindly agreed to tack it on to must-pass legislation. Senator Manchin, the senior senator from West Virginia, finally released his bill last week, and it became clear why he was so desperate to attach it to a must-pass continuing resolution. That's because the bill doesn't come even close to delivering the real common-sense changes that were promised. The provisions meant to speed up the approval process for new projects lack teeth, making them unlikely to produce any real progress. The bill doesn't touch the environmental reviews, which cause a lot of delays to happen in the first place. On top of that, it's a power grab by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, granting them unprecedented authority to force electric transmission lines on states. Under the current law, states have the authority to decide whether or not to grant transmission lines to run through their states. It's part of something called state sovereignty, federalism. Under this bill, that would change, though. The unelected leaders at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission could override a state's objection to new project transmitting lines transmitting renewable energy. In short, if a state like Illinois needs a new interstate transmission line to help meet its clean energy mandates, its neighbors will have no choice but to oblige. It will be forced on them. Folks in Indiana or Ohio or any other state could be forced to help subsidize the cost of Illinois' renewable energy. This is a far cry from the kind of common sense permitting reform that Senator Manchin has been talking about. This bill falls short in almost every regard, which is why we've seen such broad bipartisan opposition. There aren't many energy bills where my vote aligns with that of the junior senator from Vermont, Senator Sanders, but this is one of them. Despite the strong opposition to Senator Manchin's bill, the majority leader is still moving forward with a procedural vote this evening. And he knows it will fail. It will not succeed. Then Senator Schumer, the majority leader, will have a choice: pass a clean funding bill to keep the lights on, to keep government open, or shut down the government over their reckless tax and spending spree deal cut behind closed doors last summer. If you'll remember, a couple months ago, at the same time he professed publicly and privately that the disastrous radical tax and spending spree bill was dead, the senior senator from West Virginia was negotiating a sweetheart deal in secret, unbeknownst to Republicans and, by the way, unbeknownst to all Democrats other than the majority leader. Fast forward to today, when that deal falls apart this evening, he'll need to abandon his secret deal with Senator Schumer. For our country's sake, I hope the majority leader and Senator Manchin won't shut down the government. With so much economic uncertainty already, the last thing we need is a government shutdown. Madam President, on another matter, this is the last week the House of Representatives will be in session until after the election. Once the chamber gavels out at the end of the week, members will go home and they won't return until November the 14th. That doesn't leave a lot of time to accomplish the work of the American people. In fact, after this week, the House is scheduled to only be in session for 4 more weeks this year. As my colleagues here in the Senate know, the House has a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. Since the start of the Congress, the Senate has passed a long list of bipartisan bills that are still awaiting action in the House. Many of these bills passed this chamber unanimously and will provide critical support for our communities. Here's just one example. Last year, Senator Padilla, the junior senator from California, and I introduced a bill to support infrastructure and disaster relief projects all across the country. Our bill would open up billions of dollars for states and local governments to put toward their most critical projects without adding a penny to the deficit. That's because the money that would be freed up has already been appropriated for COVID-19 relief, but is in excess of what the states and local governments need for that purpose. Our bill would take the handcuffs off and allow them to spend that money if they want. They're not required to do so, but if they want, they can spend up to 1/3 of their excess funds on an infrastructure or disaster relief. And it doesn't add another penny to the deficit. Over the last year and a half, I've heard from leaders all across my state in Texas who are frustrated about the handcuffs that have been put on them when it comes to spending the money that Congress had appropriated for COVID-19 relief. Senator Padilla told me he's hearing the same thing from leaders in California. So we got to work. We spoke with folks in our states as well as our Senate colleagues and administration officials, and we came up with legislation that was simple but very effective in providing that sort of flexibility that our local communities and our states have asked for. In some places that means pandemic-related expenses, which will take a priority, but our legislation won't interfere with any plans to spend that money on already approved pandemic expenses. But it will give the states and localities without that need the option to invest those funds in infrastructure projects. And usually what happens here in Washington is the United States Congress appropriates money, and it literally takes a couple of years to get the money from D.C. down to places like Austin, Texas, where the Texas legislatures can then figure out how to disperse those funds. But now we know they already have the money in their hands, but they simply can't use it because of the restrictions placed on those funds. Senator Padilla's and my bill would remove those restrictions for important purposes like infrastructure and like disaster relief. Things like widening highways, constructing bridges, extending railways, expanding broadband. Our bill includes a long list of qualifying expenses. It also will allow leaders to put their funding toward disaster relief, which is a major need in areas all across the country. Places like Texas and Kentucky, for example, have experienced devastating flooding in the last few months. Puerto Rico, we know, has just been hit by a terrible hurricane and is still trying to restore power. Florida is bracing for impact of Hurricane Ian as it makes its way to the Gulf Coast. And California continues to battle destructive wildfires. Our bill would allow leaders to open up disaster relief funds virtually instantly as soon as the president signs the bill into law. They already have the funding in hand. They won't have to wait for a federal disaster declaration or emergency funding from Congress. They could write the check themselves and mobilize resources instantaneously. It's no surprise this bill passed the Senate 100-0. It was unanimous. These are the sort of common sense things that will benefit communities all across the United States. This bill will open up tens of millions of dollars for infrastructure projects in communities all across the country, and it will support critical disaster relief efforts as well. And it will empower state and local leaders to make the best decisions for their communities. And it will ensure that this funding can deliver on its intended purpose, which is to alleviate the financial burden imposed by the pandemic on our states and local governments. I hope Speaker Pelosi will bring up and pass this bill as quickly as possible. It would help her state of California, but more importantly, would help the entire country. But this is just one of many bipartisan bills that's currently sitting in the House. Since the start of Congress, the Senate's unanimously approved bills that I've introduced to prevent and identify child sexual abuse, to provide incarcerated individuals with access to treatment for their substance use disorder, to facilitate more cross-border trade with our neighbors to the north and the south, to support programs that help individuals experiencing mental health crises, to provide tax relief to survivors of human trafficking, to equip law enforcement officers with the tools they need in order to help people in crisis. It would be a shame if the Speaker declined to bring these bills up and pass them, and I'm sure they'd pass by overwhelming votes in the United States House of Representatives, as they did here in the Senate. But the House is only scheduled to be in session a few more weeks this Congress. It's time to get moving on these common sense, non-controversial, nonpartisan bills. Otherwise, we'll have to start back at square one next year. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
The Senate is in a quorum.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I have a short update on today's vote for the information of all senators. Later this afternoon, the Senate is scheduled to hold a cloture vote on a motion to proceed to a vehicle for the CR. Now, Senate Republicans have made very clear they will block legislation to fund the government if it includes bipartisan permitting reform, because they've chosen to obstruct instead of work in a bipartisan way to achieve something they've long claimed they wanted to do. Because American families should not be subject to a Republican-manufactured government shutdown, Senator Manchin has requested, and I have agreed, to move forward and pass the recently filed continuing resolution legislation without the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2022. Senator Manchin, myself, and others will continue to have conversations about the best way to ensure responsible permitting reform is passed before the end of the year. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, the Majority Leader, for those comments and for your leadership on this and so much else, including the subject that Senator Wyden and I will be talking about today, Social Security. I rise to discuss an issue that Senator Wyden and I have worked on. I'm honored to be part of this with a senator who began his career active in the Gray Panthers. And so his commitment to Social Security goes back to almost before I was born, Mr. President, if I could say it that way. Everything we do here, Mr. President, everything we do here should come back to the dignity of work. The idea that hard work should pay off for everyone, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, no matter what kind of work you do to support yourself and your family. When work has dignity, people always, always, always should have a secure retirement. That means they can count on Medicare. It means they can count on Social Security. It means we protect in this body. Senator Markey has been very involved in this too as the presiding officer. It means we protect people's pensions. It means people should make enough to save. It's why we saved this body. I remember sitting here with Senator Casey on March 6, 2021, and saying to him, this was the best day of my career when we voted 51-50 to protect, to save the pensions of 100,000 people in Ohio, over 1 million workers around the country. The same day we passed the child tax credit extension, which dropped the poverty rate in this country by 40%. It's why we still fight for the Delphi retirees who lost their pensions through no fault of their own, through no wrongdoing of their own, through no malfeasance or anything else of their own. They lost it because the system didn't guarantee it. It's why we'll always fight back against the tax on Social Security. A secure retirement should never be partisan. Social Security and Medicare are two of the most popular and most unifying institutions in the country. Think back, we've had Social Security since the Roosevelt days. We've had Medicare since the LBJ days. So 90 years of Social Security. The first Social Security check was in 1940 to a woman in Vermont. We've had Social Security for 82 years. Medicare passed by a Democratic House and Senate with some Republican support, joining President Johnson creating Medicare in the 1960s. Again, two of the most popular and most unifying institutions in the country. Social Security is our government's promise to working men and women, a promise they'll be able to retire with dignity. Support for Social Security among the voters, among the public, cuts across party lines, geographic lines, racial lines. Almost everybody in this country supports Social Security. Americans want to not only protect Social Security and Medicare, but they want to make it stronger. I said almost everybody in the country supports Social Security and Medicare. Well, Mr. President, as you know, and Chairman Wyden of the Finance Committee knows, almost everybody, except a whole lot of people that come to the Senate and down the hall come to the House of Representatives that think their mission is to privatize Social Security and privatize Medicare. So why do they do that? Well, it's their answer to pay for everything. How can we afford handouts to corporations? Well, the way to pay for it is you cut Social Security and you privatize Medicare. How do you pay for tax cuts for the wealthy? Well, you wipe out the retirement security of Americans, you cut Social Security, you privatize Medicare. That's their answer time after time after time. They don't really want to talk about it this close to an election. As soon as this election's over, we know the crescendo, we know the loud voices again from Senator Scott, the leader, who happens to also run the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, the senator from Florida, who's a freshman, who believes that we have to renew Medicare and Social Security for every 5 years. Like, we don't want anybody to feel comfortable or be able to plan for the future or to feel like just secure in their retirement. So it's always the same plan from the corporate elite and think tank extremists. So when I said almost everybody, I was not, Mr. President, quite fair to say it's only Republican senators, Republican House members. It's also the corporate elite in many cases. It's the people at these right-wing think tanks funded by billionaires, that think this is some way that they come up with some new scheme to disguise their unpopular agenda. Privatize Social Security or means testing Social Security. Whatever it is, the plan's the same, to kill off Social Security. This time it's Senator Rick Scott and Senate Republicans' plan to terminate Social Security. As I said, they want to get rid of this bedrock promise. It doesn't matter to them that most Americans support Social Security. That's why this week Senator Wyden, who, as I said, began his activism as an activist for the Gray Panthers in Portland, Oregon, Senator Casey, who sits next to me, one of the leaders in this Senate, senator from Pennsylvania, came to the Senate the same day I did, who's one of the leaders in this Senate and on Senator Wyden's committee to fight to affirm that Social Security should remain the guarantee for every American that we want. Because our government should work for people, not against it. When workers have dignity, when work has dignity, we honor the retirement security people earned. It should be an easy decision. I urge my Republican colleagues in this body, colleagues, frankly, with health care and retirement plans paid for by taxpayers, we all have that in this body, to think about the generations of Americans who have benefited from Social Security and the generations to come who are relying on the promise of Social Security. I've listened to their speeches for years, extolling the value of hard work. I've heard some of them try to run from their own plans to end Social Security. but American people are on to Senate Republicans. The American people watched as all 50 Republicans voted against, or essentially did nothing, to solve the multi-employer pension crisis. They're watching, a few exceptions. Senator Portman's been helpful on this, on the bipartisan Delphi retiree fix, but many are trying to block it. They're watching as the public watches as the Republican caucus tries to end Social Security for good. If the American people don't need to worry about the Republican Senate plan to end Social Security, now's your chance to prove it. This is your chance by voting. This is your chance to live up to your own words and co-sponsor this resolution that Senator Wyden and I and Senator Casey are leading. Show Americans that if you work hard all your life, your government, your senator, will be there for you, and that you're not working in this body to undermine the promise of Social Security. Senator Wyden and I have worked together to protect Social Security for years. What's at stake with these attacks? Why do we need to show a united commitment to Social Security in the United States Senate? Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. And I see in the chair another strong supporter of Social Security, distinguished senator from Massachusetts. And for colleagues who aren't aware, Senator Brown is our chair of the Subcommittee on Social Security in the Senate Finance Committee. This is a crucial subcommittee for all the reasons that Senator Brown just mentioned. And I'm just going to make a couple of points, and if my colleague is still on the floor, maybe we can have a little bit of a colloquy. What Senator Brown, pardon me?
Without objection.
Thank you. What Senator Brown has illustrated, again, is the differences between the two parties on Social Security and Medicare. And my colleague was kind enough to go back to my past as co-director of the Oregon Gray Panthers. And ever since those days, the difference between the two parties has been that on our side of the aisle, we're very blunt when we get asked about Social Security and Medicare. As Senator Brown just said, on our side, we make it clear that Social Security and Medicare are a guarantee. They're not a voucher. They're not something that's going to be thrown to the private market. They are a guarantee. What we hear from our colleagues on the other side is sort of a word salad, but it nearly always involves a statement about how much they want to protect Social Security, but then we hear a lot about privatization, about portability, about investment. It's anything but what you just heard Senator Brown say, that Medicare and Social Security are not something to be privatized. They're about a guarantee. And we should make no mistake about it. Seniors, others they have earned these benefits. And yet, somehow our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and candidates don't get what the programs are really all about. For example, not long ago, I saw a Republican Senate candidate out west say in a primary forum, Congress ought to, quote, privatize Social Security and just get the government out of it. Just get the government out of it. Now, apparently he's the nominee, and he's for protecting Social Security. Swears up and down he's for protecting Social Security. Huge about face. Heard another Westerner asked on live TV about his thoughts on Social Security. And he said nothing about a guarantee. He said we ought to look at portability issues and individual accounts and benefit cuts are on the menu. Again, this is kind of Washington lingo, Washington code for unraveling the guarantee that is Social Security and Medicare that I learned about in those days when I was co-director of the Oregon Gray Panthers. And Americans don't want their elected representatives to cut this crucial set of programs that are earned benefits. And they certainly don't want their elected officials and candidates to talk about both sides of their mouth. Now, I mentioned this question of Westerners and where Westerners stand, but apparently this opposition to these core principles of Social Security doesn't just reside in the West. It seems to have spread across the country. Senator Rick Scott has proposed ending, again, the guarantees of these bedrock programs, Social Security and Medicare, and just sunsetting them after just a few years. Sunsetting them. So as I would say to my colleague who's worked with me on a lot of these issues, let's just unpack that for a minute. We believe that Social Security and Medicare are guarantees. They're not subject to these annual political kind of battles and pushed and prodded for political advantage. They're guarantees. But yet, after quoting those in the West who want to come join us, now we have a Southerner in a position of great importance who wants to sunset programs like Social Security and Medicare after just a few years, and in effect throw them to the winds to see what kind of politics might be put in place. I don't believe that's acceptable. Senator Brown, the chair of our subcommittee, doesn't believe that's acceptable. Social Security is among the most foundational principles in our country's history, providing financial security through guaranteed benefits for millions of Americans. Over 70 million Americans receive Social Security and supplemental security income every year. Over.
Would the Senator yield for one moment?
I would be happy to,
could you,
and particularly so that you can tell everybody again why you feel so strongly.
Well, I'd like to ask you, you had said that Senator Scott, who's the chairman of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, represents the third largest state in the country, Florida. He said he wants to sunset. What exactly, just explain that so my colleagues understand. The word sunset doesn't sound so bad until you really explain it. And Senator Markey, I know, understands it, but explain that if you would.
Yeah.
As the chair of the committee.
What sunset means is you would unravel the basic principles of Social Security and Medicare. We don't subject them to annual or regular political fights. We've said people have earned those benefits. And we aren't just going to set arbitrary dates and say we're going to, in effect, move on and we'll decide what happens to seniors and disabled based on the politics of the moment. It is a 180-degree departure from the kind of guarantee that you spelled out that I feel so strongly about. We don't say we're just going to have these arbitrary changes that could put at risk the entire program.
So he's saying, then, if I understand this right, Senator White, Senator Scott, again, the chair of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, representing the third largest state in the country, he's saying if every 5 years, if the Senate doesn't say yes to Social Security and Medicare, then they're unraveled, then they die. It's up to the Senate to say yes every 5 years?
My colleague from Ohio is being way too logical, because you bet what this essentially means is if you sunset it, the program and the benefits are not going to continue as they have. And as you said, if people decide because of some particular kind of flurry at the moment, of some cause they don't want to continue it, the well-being and security of seniors is a job.
So if there's a president in a Senate and a House in 5 years that wants to privatize Medicare and end Social Security, they just block this, or a president wants to veto it, or a Senate leader like Senator McConnell that's never really believed in it, they can do nothing. They just do nuts. It's up to people who support Social Security and Medicare to keep it going every 5 years, in other words. The burden's on the supporters, the public, those who, which is to me 90% of the public or more likes this. So that's the way it works, right?
You have stated it well. It would mean that when you sunset it, you have to have a brand new fight to reestablish its primacy as a guarantee. You sunset it.
Well, and go back with that. You said a brand new fight. I'm not an historian. I like reading history, but I know enough about Medicare because I care a lot about the history as you do of that, and Senator Markey and others that, and Senator Leahy's on the floor about it too, that President Truman wanted to enact Medicare, but he couldn't get the Congress to do it. And then President Kennedy wanted to enact Medicare, and he couldn't get Congress to do it. It probably took the Kennedy assassination and all that was happening to sort of light a fire under Congress to pass Medicare. So you would need that kind of political will. In other words, it took almost 20 years to pass Medicare. So if Medicare were to expire, you would need a huge public wave with elected officials that want to do it to get it back in effect.
No question about it, and it would put in jeopardy fundamental core principles that seniors all across the country in Ohio and Oregon and Massachusetts have been able to count on. When you sunset it, you say you can't count on it. You have to wait for another political battle. And I would just say to my colleagues, showing how extreme the position is of our colleague from Florida, Senator Scott, Senator Orrin Hatch, the late Senator Hatch, who worked with us, when he was in the Senate, he said, we'll update the Medicare guarantee to start covering chronic care. This is something the senator from Massachusetts has worked with me on, home care for seniors. So Senator Orrin Hatch, not exactly our late colleague and my personal friend, was not exactly a liberal. He understood what you and I are talking about, that Medicare and Social Security are a guarantee. And when we talked about chronic care, he said, we're going to update the Medicare guarantee. Nothing about saying, well, gee, maybe we'll do something after we sunset it. So my colleague has said it well.
Let me ask another question. So if Senator Scott gets his way and Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, gets his way, and all those new candidates that Senator Scott is helping get elected to the Senate, if they get their way and pass Senator Scott's bill to sunset, would Senator Scott still have government health care and a government pension?
He hasn't talked about it, but I think that would certainly be one of the questions our constituents would ask about, because this issue of there being a double standard between seniors at home and their elected officials would be very real. He hadn't spelled out how he would deal with this, but certainly the question of elected officials, because we have these retirement benefits that have been part, again, of a program that's been established for some time. They haven't been talked about. But I'll tell you, I think, as chair of the Social Security Subcommittee and myself on the Finance Committee, we're going to go out there and say no double standard. You can be sure of that. If something is sunsetted for working people and seniors and disabled, we are certainly not going to let Senator Scott pretend that somehow it's business as usual for elected officials. Mr. President, I think Senator Brown started us off very well, and he's asking questions that I think millions of Americans are going to ask. My understanding is that my colleague from Ohio, as chairman of the subcommittee, is going to be looking at a lot of these issues in his subcommittee, but certainly this last point about politicians talking out of both sides of their mouth and saying somehow we're going to have a program sunsetted for seniors and the disabled, Social Security, Medicare, and others, but we're not going to even talk about what happens for elected officials, is an example of how you shouldn't legislate. It's an example of what I believe could be a double standard. And I'll just close unless Senator Brown wants to. In fact, I want to let Senator Brown do it. I thought, as I listened to Senator Brown, and I put it in the context of all these years with the Gray Panthers, everybody can understand what Senator Brown is talking about. Medicare and Social Security are a guarantee, period, inviolate, as a result of the history that we had in this country where people worked so hard for this. On the other side, we're talking about privatization, we're talking about portability, we're talking about lots of new cost analyses in the private sector and individualized programs. I'm for individualized programs on top of Social Security, not in place of it. So I really appreciate your resolution, Senator Brown, and I'm going to do everything I can to support it.
Thank you, Senator Wyden, and I will yield back my time in 30 seconds. Mr. President, thank you for your indulgence, and Senator Leahy will be speaking in a moment. And Senator Wyden, the chair of the Finance Committee, we're just asking for co-sponsors. We have a number of our colleagues that have co-sponsored this to make sure that Social Security is with us, a strong, good Social Security system as long as we are a nation. So I yield the floor. Thank you.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I understand the vote is going to be soon. I ask consent that it be after I finish my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. President, listening to Senator Wyden and Senator Brown about Social Security, I would tell my colleagues that the first recipient of Social Security was a Vermonter. And Vermont was at that time, I believe, the most Republican state in the nation. I remember growing up as a child, hearing so many people say, well, I may disagree with a whole lot of things Franklin Roosevelt and Democrats did, but Social Security, I'm all for that. And I learned that as a child, and it's been part of my mantra ever since, along with Senator Brown and Senator Wyden. Social Security is a contract, and we should follow it. Now, another matter, Mr. President, today the Senate will vote to vote cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 6833. And what that means, we take up a substitute amendment containing a continuing resolution to fund the federal government through December 16th. December 16th is an important date, and we should have it done by then. So I'll vote to invoke cloture and move the process forward. I'd urge both Republicans and senators to do that. You know, funding the federal government is the most basic responsibility of Congress. The continuing resolution before the Senate today will keep vital services running for the American people through December 16th, provide critical support for Ukraine, and secure the LIHEAP safety net, which is so needed ahead of winter, and provide emergency relief to communities recovering from natural disasters all over our great country. This is an important step, but it is, of course, just a temporary step because we will finish the omnibus bill with all appropriations in it by December 16th. As chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I'm committed to completing the work of the Appropriations Committee before the end of this Congress. And I'm seeking bipartisan support on both the Republican side and the Democratic side. My staff, myself, and the staffs and members, key members in the House, we worked throughout most of the August recess, going through thousands of pages to make sure this is possible. Because it's a time of rising inflation. Everything is costing more. Energy, food, fuel, housing. We must respond accordingly. Running on autopilot after December would be irresponsible. The American people deserve more, I repeat that. We're in a time of rising inflation. Everything is costing more: energy, food, fuel, housing. We have to respond accordingly. If you run on autopilot in this country after December, that would be irresponsible. American people deserve more. We know how bad it was when the government closed down for its longest period during the last administration. That cost Americans billions of dollars, totally wasted. You know, our federal agencies, people are talking about the government. Let's look at our federal agencies. They run thousands of programs every day that benefit working families, from nutrition programs to small business loans and grants, from affordable housing to health care for our nation's veterans, from child care services to our nation's schools. The federal government provides services that impact nearly every aspect of American life. So we can't fund these critical programs at last year's levels without cutting services or underfunding needs. It's simple math. Enacting a full-year appropriations bill into law must be our top priority. We owe it to the Americans who sent us here, no matter what their political background is, and no matter what part of the country they come from. So look at the several urgent and pressing issues that cannot wait. This bill contains $1 billion to bolster LIHEAP ahead of winter. People are going to be facing higher fuel costs because of Putin's war in Ukraine. And inflation, also caused partly by that, will drive energy costs even higher. No family should have to choose between heating their home or buying food, not in my state of Vermont, but not in any community anywhere in the country. And I'm glad that we're able to come together and secure these resources. It also has $12.35 billion in emergency assistance for Ukraine. We further demonstrate our resolve to stand with the people of Ukraine against President Putin's illegal, brutal war on their country. We're going to stand up to a man who has committed war crimes. And the bill provides $2.5 billion to support recovery efforts. I think of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire in New Mexico, the largest fire in New Mexico's history, has scorched hundreds of thousands of acres. It's destroyed homes, it's displaced thousands. It's sparked a fresh water crisis in New Mexico. We're the United States of America, so we support all states in America. And the bill includes $2 billion in community development block grants to help address unmet recovery needs in communities experiencing major disasters in 2021 and 2022, such as Kentucky and Missouri and Puerto Rico. And with Hurricane Ian advancing in the Gulf, the continuing resolution also includes an additional $18.8 billion for the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund. This is a fund that protects all Americans, and we have to ensure that FEMA has the resources to meet this challenge. The bill provides those resources. I am disappointed that due to Republican opposition, there's no additional funding to combat COVID-19 or monkeypox. I think not providing these resources is short-sighted. And so I'll continue to fight for the necessary funding to continue to combat these terrible diseases, and we will revisit this issue in the omnibus. So now Congress must do its job and complete the appropriations process before the end of the year. I look forward to working with the people I've been working with for the past several months. And I would single out Vice Chairman Shelby, Chair DeLauro, Ranking Member Granger. We continue the work we've been doing. We can get this done. More importantly for the American people, we have to get this done. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 389, H.R. 6833, an act to amend Title 28 of the Public Health Service Act, and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 19 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 6833, an act to amend Title 27 of the Public Health Service Act, the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, and the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 to establish requirements with respect to cost sharing for certain insulin products and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez.
May I vote aye?
Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Bennett, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Ernst, Feinstein, Heinrich, Kane, King, Leahy, Markey, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Tillis, Warnock, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Crapo, Fisher, Marshall, Risch, Scott of Florida. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. McConnell, Aye. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Cotton, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 72 and the nays are 23. 3/5 of the Senate duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, today I have the distinct honor of recognizing Dr. Doug Reisig of Missoula County as Montanan of the Month for his distinguished career as an educator and for his devotion to Montana students, Montana parents, and the community. Doug was born and raised in Montana. He earned his master's degree from the University of Montana and his PhD from Montana State. Back home in Montana, cat grizz bipartisanship is what Doug has in his background. You see, Doug taught at Billings West High School before accepting a job at the St. Ignatius School District. It was in St. Ignatius that he met his lovely wife, Mary Jo. Doug and Mary Jo have been married for almost 43 years and have raised two wonderful daughters, Megan and Callie. They are now the proud grandparents of 4 grandsons. Doug has been a teacher, a building administrator, and superintendent for 46 years, serving as a superintendent at Hellgate Elementary for the past 34 years. Prior to his retirement, he received the G.V. Erickson Award from the School Administrators of Montana for his contribution to education in our great state. And since Doug took over as superintendent, the school has seen a 33% increase in enrollment. He also oversaw the construction of the new middle school. And during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, under Doug's leadership, Hellgate Elementary was a leader in delivering meals to children in need, and even went the extra mile by selflessly donating his increase in salary to the Family Resource Fund. With Doug's direction and precautions in place, both Hellgate Elementary and Middle School were in session 5 days a week during the 2020 and 2021 school years. It is my honor to recognize Dr. Doug Reisig for serving the state of Montana as an educator and for his dedication to ensuring that Montana students have a very bright future ahead. So congratulations on your retirement, Doug. You truly make Montana proud.
See you guys in an hour.